work we are doing, developing strategy for the future in terms of energy transition that people are all excited about, negatively or positively. And of course, this got a much bigger play after Total indicated a little over a year ago that it expected to get rid or to write down to zero its crude oil holdings. The campaign brag from some years ago that one day cars will run on water seems not to be one of those glittering generalities anymore. It seems to be a possibility. And so there is a big question of how we are getting ready for the energy transition. But very importantly, as we speak, there is big conversation around the pricing of PMS in our country and the subject of subsidies or lack thereof. And there is, of course, the big question of the efficiencies of a system. As one former executive in the industry put it, marketing is about pipelines. And since we've got a challenge with pipelines, how can we be efficient in distribution? Just a thought out there. But today, I'm really truly pleased that the industry's best and brightest are sitting together for us to reflect on where we're coming from first and foremost. It's called the Nigeria History Series because we like to look at people who, in times past and present, were involved in policy making, the execution of the outcome of policy, and how all of these add together to create a better life for the people of Nigeria. But the primary reason why we do this is to allow a new generation of leaders to engage how choice was made in the previous period so that we may be able to make much better choices going forward. As I like very often to point out, from the Harry Potter series writer, J.K. Rowling, we are the choices we make. There is no problem, there is no challenge that we're dealing with today that did not result from the kind of choices we made yesterday. And so getting to come to terms with how we make choices so that tomorrow will be better than yesterday is a very important thing, I think. As a result of that, our hope is that the future decision makers who engage our conversation today at some point will learn enough to perhaps avoid certain kinds of choices or go more for other kinds of choices so that altogether will be more successful as an economy. I'm going to begin today. We have a broad representation of the industry, but the grand player from times back when they moved from multinational status and engaged this subject as regulation, which determined in times previous that the players were primarily either the NNPC or multinational players, to a time when the gates began to be open to indigenous participation in the downstream sector. And so, in many ways, Mr. Tunjo Ibanji bestrides a very important part of our history. And I think that it's appropriate that I begin with him to pose the question, why has the downstream sector been so problematic since, literally the 80s? In a way, I'm a child of this industry. My father worked for British Petroleum, and I remember the tank farm even in Guzo in 1962, 63. And the rail coaches will bring petrol to Guzo, and the tank farm right there with uh, uh, um, the rail line passing literally through it would discharge into those tanks, and small trucks will take fuel to everywhere in that northwest, including all the way to Niger Republic. My father's territory went into Niger Republic. When I was a kid, I was on vacation. I would travel with him, even into Niger, for BP stations and all of that. What went wrong, and why did fuel distribution become such an issue in Nigeria, and ultimately how indigenous participation has helped or hindered, if you want, the process? Mr. Ebanji, welcome to the Nigeria History Series. If
Thank you.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you very much, Prof. My distinguished old boy, both at St. Gregory's and Loyola College. It's a privilege to be part of this discussion this afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, fellow participants, and everybody listening to this very laudable series. Yes, I think Prof has told us a bit of history. And like he did say when he was introducing me, I think to a certain extent, I am very much part of that history. In fact, if I had a whole day to talk about this industry, I doubt if it would have been enough. So I'll try and be brief. I walked into the premises of Mobil Oil Nigeria Limited, as it then was called, as a 23-year-old young man on December 29th, 1980. Having finished my youth service after in 1979, stroke 80, after 2 months of finishing my youth service, I resumed duty. And the story of why I resumed on December 29th is a story for another time. Now, what did I meet? Well, I met an industry where the downstream, as far as marketing was concerned, was dominated by what we call the majors. So these were essentially offshoots of Shell, Texaco, as it then was known, Mobil, Elf, Total. They dominated the downstream in the industry at the time. We had a market where there were two main gasoline products. There was regular gasoline and there was super gasoline. So that's one first thing I want you to take a hold of. There was some degree of choice for consumers for petrol. If you had a more expensive car, you could buy for a slightly higher price, a higher quality fuel. At that time, the price in Lagos for regular, this is more than 40 years ago now, so forgive me if my numbers are not exact, but I think it was 9.5 kobo in Ibadan, in Lagos, and 10 kobo in Ibadan. That was for regular gasoline. And again, another point you need to keep as an aide-memoire is the fact that there was a bit of a price differential between Lagos and Ibadan, which was accounted for because of the difference in transportation of delivering product to Ibadan versus Lagos. At our Papa terminal, like Prof said, there were rail sidings. So we actually loaded petrol into tanks and placed them on the rail network and delivered products to Kano, to Gusau, to all those places that he has mentioned. It was a fairly efficient system. A lot of products were moved in this way across the length and breadth of the country. And then definitely there's nothing like shortages and whatever. So I would say the highlight of the time was that the companies were virtually running the business. There was limited government intervention in whatever it is we were doing. And to a large extent, things were running smoothly. There were hardly instances of petrol queues or runouts or things like that. In fact, as a young marketer, it was almost taboo for my station to run out of fuel. I could get a query if that happened. So what then has happened over the years? For me, I think things started going awry when government intervention started getting more and more and more and more, up to the point today where we have pricing policies in place, we have a lot of policies in place, which I dare say may have ended up, rather than moving the industry forward, may have actually moved us backward. Subsequently, we had the whole network of pipelines. Over 5,000 kilometers of pipelines were built. So again, apart from the rail system, there was now a network of pipelines that was aimed at distributing products to 22 government depots across the country. Again, all this was supposed to make life easier, more efficient, and so on and so forth. But I think some of the missteps we made were, for instance, we insisted that petrol had to be sold at the same price throughout Nigeria, ostensibly for good reasons, but at the end of the day, when you do that, sometimes you end up distorting the economics that is the backlog of, or the bedrock of, virtually all products that are economic value. The market itself normally has a way of allocating resources in such a way that things get delivered at a particular location based on the price of movement of the product. Another challenge with fixing the price came with the fact that all around us, all our neighbors, gradually moved away from fixing prices to sort of market denominated price, or at least prices based on the landing cost of the fuel. Again, government intervention in Nigeria, ostensibly to make life easier for people, especially because we believed we had crude oil, we fixed our price. And when other people around us were changing and going to prices that are based on how much does it cost to land the product in our country, and then fixing the price based on that, we decided to go into what you might describe as a subsidy regime, whereby the local population was protected from the real cost of the product. So at the end of the day, all that did was encourage people to move the product across border, where it was much more expensive than what it was in Nigeria. So all these distortions gradually started to erode the industry, the kind of investments that needed to be made to keep the industry at tip-top shape were not made anymore. So for instance, government made all those investments in the pipeline, but as government resources started to get strained, the pipeline system started to deteriorate, and there wasn't significant investment being made. And the private sector, which otherwise would have taken up that gap, because the prices and margins that they earn were fixed by government and never kept pace with inflation, the private sector did not make those investments. And like Prof said in his example, we are the choices we made. Because we made those kind of choices, the investments that needed to be made were never made. And that goes for refining, it goes for the pipeline system, and so on and so forth. So what you find is that the industry gradually over these 30, 40 years gradually continued to deteriorate until you now have a pipeline network that we can hardly use until the Dangote refinery and some of these recent modular refineries. There had been no significant investment in upgrading and keeping our refineries robust. So we became a nation dependent solely on importation. At the same time, demand was growing, population was growing. So we find ourselves in a very big dilemma, and it is until we make those fundamental strategic changes or choices, we can begin to see some degree of recovery in the industry. Now, there have been some positive developments. For instance, when I started my story, I talked about the fact that it was dominated by foreign multinationals. So local players have become very significant today. In fact, for most of those multinational companies, they have been bought over by local indigenous players. So that is a very, very positive development. However, the bedrock of the industry is still these very, very intrusive government policies that have upset the equilibrium in the industry and have caused a significantly low level of investment compared to where we need to be today. So let me stop here. I'm sure other participants may want to say a few things, but I will make other interventions as we progress. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We're hoping that you will come in several times during the course of the conversation. But what I would like to do is take what you have said, because it presents us the spectrum around which our conversation will take place. I mean, you introduced our old boy backgrounds. One of those old boy background things is from Loyola College. That one of the managing directors of the Warri Refinery back in those days was Mr. James Owokalu, who happens also to be a Loyolan. And I remember that when we go to old boys meetings, he would just express incredible frustration with managing the Warri Refinery and the games that were played and all of that. I will come back to that in the course of this conversation. But what I would like to do is invite Winnie Akpani to kind of present us the current spectrum of challenges that the industry, which is significantly indigenized now, faces, and what can be done to ease effectiveness of play in the industry.
Thank you very much, Prof. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, participants and fellow speakers. Thank you for inviting me to this series. I'm glad to be here. And thank you for starting with the guru of the industry, Mr. Evanji. Thank you, Mr. Evanji, for that insightful summary of the industry. Two things I would have taken from what he said, which I think are very, very significant and part of the reason why we are where we are today. Okay, the biggest issue is the government, you call it intervention, but I would rather call it involvement I think it's more of government involvement. It started as an intervention, but what we now see is complete involvement by government in every facet. I think when they started off, it was well thought out, it was meaningful, with the welfare and well-being of the Nigerian people in mind. But where we are today, is it has complicated a lot of matters. I'll pick up what he said. Insisting that petrol has to be sold at the same price from one part of Nigeria to the farthest end through subsidy or whatever it is the government designed is one of the, okay. Sorry about that. I hope my video is on now. Okay. It's one of the major problems we've had. We've had quite a lot of investment by indigenous players in the past 20 to 25 years, very, very significant. And like he said, we even have indigenous players that have bought over some of the multinationals, which is a good thing, because at least you know that at the end of the day, the money stays here. Okay, but have we had adequate government support for these investments? Why are we where we are today? He talked about investment in infrastructure. Yes, like Prof said, so many years ago, he remembered going with his father and all that. But what was the population of Nigeria at the time? What have we done in those 40, 50 years? How much investment have we made in infrastructure? But again, we've had the local indigenous players come in, to actively participate. But what level of investment have we made? And what has government done to actually make sure that those investments are multiplied? Every businessman goes into a business to make returns to shareholders. And who are your shareholders? They're not just the people who put in the money. You have the community, you have the general public, and everybody is a shareholder in your business, even if it's 100% owned by you, but you have various shareholders. And you have a duty to make returns to everybody that has invested in your business. After all, wherever you build a facility, maybe depot or filling station, you're building a community, and you also have a responsibility to that community. So what have we done, and where are we today? Government continues to regulate everything in the oil industry, but thank God that at least we're getting close to the end of seeing the PIB come into play, even though with a lot of disagreements here and there. But at least we're having a PIB that hopefully should begin to address some of these issues. One major issue is the issue of deregulation. Nobody is going to continue making investment without some form of guarantee that is going to have a return on what is investing. Okay, now government wants to encourage refining, and let's use our crude. We can't just be doing 2.1 million barrels every day and we export everything. Okay, and even the one that is meant for refineries, we still give to the DSDP in exchange for imports. Okay, fine, it's wonderful to say we have to encourage refining, but the man who wants to spend so much millions or billions of dollars investing in refineries has to have some form of assurance that he's going to get a return on his investment. How do you get a return when the government is going to wake up tomorrow and change the rule again? That is what has been happening in the oil industry. Every day we get new rules, we get new regulations. You can't do this, you can't do that. I built a depot with 10 billion, and then you tell me that I can only get 2 naira per liter for storing in that depot. That does not even begin to maintain the depot, not to talk about paying the staff salaries, not to talk, so government has to get out of this involvement. It's not an intervention. You intervene when you want to make things right. I don't see that government has made anything right with this level of intervention. Even if you continue to say that the ideals were lofty, we wanted to protect the consumer, ABC and that. But now that we've had a lot of indigenous players make substantive and substantial investment in the downstream, can governments give us enabling laws that will ensure that these investments are going to come with returns? So that even when you say that the major marketers are divesting or doing bigger things, so they want to leave this because they think that there's a lot of indigenous expertise that can handle, the downstream. But you want to make sure that the laws that are given are okay and they can protect the businesses. After all, at the end of the day, what do we really want? The consumer is the king bottom line. Right now, we think that the consumer is the king, but no, the consumer is still being taken for granted. Even if today petrol is being landed at 309 naira per liter, but what are we selling? At the pump, after all expenses, we're still selling 162. It sounds like yes, the consumer is benefiting today, but it's not. We're just postponing the evil day. If we're not making investments, if we're not having a competition, we're not going to have serious investment coming to this industry. And that is what we need. That's why we don't have infrastructure. People are not investing as much as they should invest. If you tell a foreigner, come and invest in a regulated market, it is very, very difficult convincing them. It's almost an impossibility. So I think this is one thing that we need to look at. For us local investors, okay, a lot of people are just, bidding the time, trying to make the best. But I tell you what I've seen of Nigerian business, especially in the oil industry, because this is what I really know, I've done this for over 20 years, is that you see people who are determined, and no matter what government has done, it has not broken them. We have continued to offer the service, and people always think, oh, the marketers are making so much money. You will be amazed if I tell you that the average markup, bottom line, is 1% to 2%. And that's the truth. You can check anybody's books. You don't make more than that. You actually pray that at the end of the year, you have made more money than you have lost, because that's marketing. But if you have free market, it becomes easier for you to know, let me invest in this. You can plan
talk
better.
about government involvement, intervention, and all of that. The biggest part for me, and this is something I write about and talk about very frequently, is that the mindset of regulation in Nigerian culture is the mindset of the policeman. It's the mindset of power rather than the mindset of creating.
Absolutely.
You are very correct, Prof.
You know,
that is the problem. That's why I called it involvement, not intervention.
Yeah. And this, in my view, is not just in your sector, in almost every aspect of the economy, is the biggest danger to economic growth in Nigeria. How does your industry engage regulators in a manner that they can have learning, because unless the rate of learning is equal to or greater than the pace of change, which we're dealing with here, a lot of change, we are all moving to dinosaur status. How does your industry, and maybe I should turn to Gabriel Ogbeche on this. I mean, all of you are investing significantly in infrastructure. How do you engage the regulator to understand, appreciate the level of investments and the need for more enabling than bullying in the relationship between regulator and players?
Thank you very much, Prof. Let me start by acknowledging the first two speakers, Mrs. Winifred Akpani and Mr. Oyebanji, for their very important contribution to this, this discussion today, which I consider to be very timely. Engagement with regulators is a continuous process, because the oil industry and the downstream sector especially is a highly regulated industry. So government takes a very active interest in what we're doing in this industry. As a matter of fact, I wonder if there's any other sector of the economy that is as regulated as the downstream. You want to build a petrol station, you need approval. You need to bury a tank, you need approval. You want to load product to the petrol station, you need approval. And then the biggest elephant in the room, you want to sell that product, the price at which you're going to sell that product is also very highly regulated. And I think that's where I would say we have a challenge with that regulation. The biggest elephant in the room today, as far as the downstream is concerned, is the failure, so to speak, of the government to deregulate the downstream. Fixing the price at which petroleum products are sold today, I believe is very seriously harmful to this economy. Today, you want to bring in petrol into this country. I think petrol should be landing, if I go with the figures Mrs. Akpani quoted, about at least 300 naira per liter, basis where the exchange rate is today. Petrol is being sold for anything between 162 to 165. I believe that petrol is being subsidized today with at least 100 naira per liter. If you look at the national consumption of anything between 60 to 80 million liters per day, we are spending about 8 billion naira every day just to subsidize one product. If we continue this way, we are going to end this year spending about 2 trillion naira subsidizing just one product called petrol. 2 trillion naira for Nigeria today, that is more money than we spend on education, on health, on transportation, on very critical infrastructure. I mean, for the parallel state of our finances today, there is so much more we can do with that kind of money than expending it just subsidizing one product. So I seriously believe that government should get their feet off the pedal as far as the pricing of petroleum products are concerned. Yes, it's going to hurt on the short term in terms of, so to speak, making things a bit more expensive for the population, but there are also going to be a lot of quick wins in terms of being able to provide so much more services for the people. And at the end of the day, I think the net effect is going to be better for everyone. So regulation for the government, it's something which we'll keep engaging with them. And we want to believe that sooner rather than later, we'll move this industry in the right direction.
You know, these kinds of things cannot go on forever. At the pace we are going, by next year's budget, literally speaking, we'll be spending the entire revenues of the federal government on debt servicing alone. And when we are at that level, government has to think, wait a minute, we've got to stop spending some things that don't make sense. If they then say, how can your industry facilitate not having big bang? We know where we must go. We're going there. Are there any thoughts in your industry about how you could proceed to deregulate without, you know, everything just blow up one day? And you know, are there any thoughts of that nature in your dialogue within the industry? I'll take your perspective, and I'll move to Yomi.
Those thoughts are there. Today, we are dealing with a potential big bang in terms of price increase because we have kept the price fixed for a very long time. Yes. If the industry was deregulated, we would have been seeing a gradual inch up in the price of petrol at a level that you will not even notice. It goes up by 5 naira today, it comes back down by 3 naira the next day, it goes up by 8 naira the next day, it comes back by 4 naira the following day. So that even if we are at this point today, you're not going to get that big bang. But when you draw a fixed line on price, regardless of where the price of crude oil goes, and regardless of where the exchange rate of the naira goes, then you suddenly create a huge difference between where the price should be and where it actually is. Incidentally, I believe that petrol should not only be deregulated, it should be taxed. There should be tax on petrol. Petrol should be a source of income for the government from a tax perspective, rather than a bottomless pit through which they spend money. I remember during the Obasanjo administration, when he scrapped the toll gates, one of the things he did was that he introduced a 1 naira per liter tax on petrol. So for every liter of petrol,
but you know, in most economies in the world,
per liter goes into a fund on which those same roads should be maintained. But
in most economies in the world,
Nigerian Labour Congress went on strike and scuttled that program, and we've not gone back to it. So today, just imagine if government not only deregulated, but they are collecting, even if it's 1 or 2 naira per 1 naira or 2 naira per liter as tax. Government will be talking of income of at least 160 million naira every day to fix the roads, rather than saying that they are spending 8 billion naira every day to subsidize petrol. So we need to change that mindset. We need to change our thinking. So that's the way I look at it.
No, I agree with you. Highways, I mean, the United States maintains its highways from a gasoline tax, which is a specific use tax that you then use to build the highways to facilitate things. But here, unfortunately, we traveled a wrong direction. Now, let me turn to Mr. Obuku and ask him. There are people who say that the industry can become more efficient, either with technology or whatever else, to reduce its operating costs and decrease the burden, and that perhaps it's a challenge of efficiency or the inefficiency that is being passed on to consumers. Do you agree with that, or what do you think can be done to reduce cost of producing petrol, refining, distributing, to make the cost lower?
Well, good afternoon, Prof, and good afternoon to all my bons on the panel. As you know, Prof, putting me alongside some of these people, if we were meeting physically, I would start by prostrating. These are people that I met in the industry who I look up to, who've done very well. So please, I send my regards to you all. And Prof, thanks for this. Before I answer your question on technology, I wanted to just throw 2 or 3 points following from what Mr. Oyebanji, Dame, and Mr. Ogbechi have spoken about. Perhaps history will note the Nigerian downstream as one that never seized an opportunity to reform and help the country reshape. To answer your questions directly, the industry is full and filled with white papers on what and what not to do to reform. That's not our issue. It perhaps has the most prominent entrepreneurs in any sector in the economy. People who've gone on to do things globally, who've turned water into wine. Some are on the call, from shipping to infrastructure development to retail. And so entrepreneurship is not the issue. They've raised capital globally, billions of naira, despite successive repressive regulation. The businesses are still alive, hiring thousands of people, paying taxes and billions to the government. And so, if we were going to give them plaques, they would all receive plaques. But I think the one thing the industry's got to ask itself is, why has it willingly allowed the people they call government to decide the outcomes? And I'm not blaming anybody in government. Indeed, some of the persons here could be in government tomorrow and the industry will be the same. Some of our friends are in government, ex-members of some of our organizations are in regulatory positions today. So it's not the fault of those people. And we can sit here and say government, government, government. But frankly, I don't know that government is the issue. I have to tell you, Prof, I find that perhaps the industry hasn't taken the opportunities that have been presented to itself to press on reforms on the things it agrees on and leaves the things that it doesn't agree on eventually to take shape. We are not at loss to what we agree on. How many of them have we successfully implemented? And so technology, if you like, might be super important and might drive down costs and might bring innovation and might help improve the skill sets and might help us hire more people and increase transparency, etc. But it itself is a slave to our belief that government has to do something before something happens. And that's not my belief. My belief is, Prof, if this was a family meeting and people were not listening, my belief is we should all say to ourselves, whether the eminent personalities on this group, whether the chairmen and chairwomen of the unions, the private sector groups, even on this chat, and whether the independent CEOs who've done great things. The question is, what have we done to implement the things that we agree upon, which would have started to ensure that the regulators were better guided as to what the industry required to do immediately, without which, in fact, there will be no industry. What have we done on those things so that the things that we discussed with Professor Pato told me will be the things we don't agree upon? Those will be my initial thoughts. Again, thanks very much, Prof. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Now, just to put another piece of this jigsaw puzzle in place, what happened with the downstream is going to happen across the board in the oil industry in terms of indigenous play. I think the last week we have heard one of the majors announce that it's leaving Nigeria. Funny enough, on the episode before this, one or so before, when we had Austin Avuru and Dr. Lai Fatono and co talking upstream, we were kind of in agreement that multinationals will leave the country in the upstream sector. And that one of the key challenges is how the indigenous play entry will engage so that the value that will be created will be different from how a multinational sees a territory. Well, MRS is one of those that has transitioned from multinational play to indigenous ownership. And I'm hoping that Ms. Amina can give us a sense for part of the challenge that there is in stepping into an environment in which multinationals have created a certain culture versus the way that new indigenous players need to handle things to affect the terrain. I just give a simple example. When the regulator deals with multinationals, the attitude ordinarily should be different from when indigenous people who were in the same secondary schools with these fellows who, look, this is my business is hurting, and you guys need to see these things more clearly. This is the common good of our country, as different from approaching some multinational which can seek backup from somewhere, by the way, and so on and so forth. What has been your experience, and how does this industry begin to recognize that very soon it will be majorly indigenous play?
Good evening, Prof. And thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you, Mrs. Akpani, Mr. Oyebanji, Gabriel, and Yomi. Following up on what they've all said, I think we can't really address the issue of indigenous participation without touching a bit on the history which they have so eloquently given us to help people understand the obstacles, so to say, that we faced in the industry as a whole, not just whether you're an indigenous company taking over a multinational. One of the problems we have that I see, and which everyone has spoken about, is the issue of overregulation. And when I say overregulation, what I mean by that is, on the one hand, I think it was Mr. Ogbechi who mentioned the fact that this industry is probably the most regulated industry. You have DPR, you have Ministry of Environment, you have Ministry of Investment. You would always find that you have the same issues being regulated by 3 or 4 different ministries or parastatals. And at some point you start to ask yourself, why can't we have a situation where we know it's the Petroleum Ministry that is responsible for regulation, and all the other ministries can then go to them and say, this is what we would like to see from you, right? So call it a one-stop shop if you like. Because what then tends to happen is we're constantly being disrupted by one regulation or the other. You deal with an issue, you think you're done with that. And just to borrow from what Mr. Oyebanji talked about, for example, in the beginning with the retail stations, you have weights and measure. You think, okay, my pumps are regulated by DPR. Then you have someone come up tomorrow from maybe Ministry of Trade and they say, oh, they want to look into that. So just in terms of regulation, I think that the PIB or whatever regulation is passed going forward needs to help to address this. Now, coming back to the question which you asked, where we've gone from acquiring a multinational and making it a wholly indigenous company as we have today. First thing I'd say is the industry is global. So it doesn't matter whether you're an indigenous company or you're a multinational, the standards across board are the same. Because at this point, we're talking about safety in handling products which are highly, highly combustible. So in terms of safety, your HSE, even in just the way that you work and you deal, it's global. Also because as indigenous companies, most of us who are in the industry today are not only operating in Nigeria. If you take MRS, for example, we're across West Africa. So when it comes to indigenization, there's only so much you can do in terms of indigenization when it comes to dealing with regulators. But what you want to have all the time is you want to have standards that, irrespective of which country you are operating in, those standards are upheld. Now, in terms of dealing with the regulators, because we are an indigenous company, yes, it helps. It helps it goes a long way. Because when I'm speaking to someone in DPR, for example, we're able to put our issues on the table, but bring those issues back home to bear. We're able to explain to them that, look, don't just see things and think, oh, this is an oil company, they make so much money. You heard what Mrs. Akpani said about everybody thinking, oh, the industry makes so much money. But the reality is the margins are so thin that the industry is actually a volume business. So the more you're able to throughput, the more you're able to turn around or turn over, then you make more. And it doesn't matter what product you're dealing with or what you're handling. So when a regulator comes and says, oh, I'm going to shut you down because you haven't done this or done that, the advantage we have is we're able to bring it home to say, listen, we don't even think there's an opportunity for us not to follow your regulations, but maybe we need time because we're a new company and don't have the kind of R&D that the multinationals have given their years of experience, but work with us to get us to that point where we meet all of the standards that you want. So it's a gradual process, but we're able to have those conversations because we can then explain to them that we're not coming from nothing. Where we're at, we intend to get to where you want us to get to. But the dialogue is a lot easier because you're dealing with people who, maybe by virtue of the fact that you've been in the industry long enough, you've known them. You know, just like Yomi said, some of our colleagues today are in these positions. So that goes a long way in helping us. But in terms of the transitioning process, I wouldn't say there's a difference when you're transitioning as a Nigerian company or a multinational, because ultimately in this industry, global best practices must be respected. Your HSE must be world-class because of the nature of what you're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. One of the things that I was trying to point to when I talked about the difference between, say, a local player versus a multinational is that sometimes multinationals are constrained by their global strategy or practices. A sector, for example, that I used only a couple of days ago as example, the herbicides, pesticides business in Nigeria. At the time that the our World Bank ADPs, drove expansion of practice in agriculture, those ADPs introduced local farmers to the use of pesticides, herbicides. They found them very useful. But when the ADPs ran out of funding and local farmers used to getting them from the ADPs wanted them, the multinationals were selling in drums and such kinds of volumes that small farmers could not afford. So the concept of the wealth at the bottom of the pyramid led indigenous, engagement from one of the former managers in one of those multinationals, bringing in generics and packaging them in small. So this is one example of how a multinational policy could affect local play. Because, oh no, sorry, in Paris, we do it like this. On the other hand, a multinational can have backup that is global. I'll give you another example for manufacturing. When the government made a decision years ago about the brewing industry, you must use local sources of malted barley imported from abroad. Mr. Felix Ohiwere, who was managing Nigerian breweries at the time, flew to the Netherlands and said to his colleagues there, I need to have indigenous input that can give me the same taste for star beer. And they said to him, and he said that on this series, when we were on manufacturing, he said, look, Felix, it's going to be hard, but we can do it. And they worked at it. And just as they broke through and began to do it, the government changed policy. And everything was upended, again. And so that's part of what I wanted some reflection on in the advantages and disadvantages of being a multinational in that kind of sector versus being an indigenous player. But let me return to Tunji Ebanji one more time to raise this issue that has continually challenged the sector, which is the fact that, as several of us have mentioned, margins are thin, razor thin in selling a commodity like petrol. And so many years ago, players realized that their great advantage was traffic. And so people like your mobile had their mini-marts. They probably made more money from mini-mart than from selling petrol. And Total had Bonjour, and so on and so forth. Now, beyond selling groceries to people who cannot but enter a forecourt to get petrol, are there any thoughts about how efficiencies or better performance can come from scope economies, from using that base of the fact that people will traffic into a forecourt to get petrol, to get them other services that can then make up for the fact that the margins are razor thin in a commodities business like petrol?
Thank you very much, Prof. It's that question is quite interesting because at some point, as part of Mobile Oil Corporation's global strategy, we started to recognize at the time that in some cases we are actually dealing in real estate. You have a piece of land primarily aimed at selling gasoline, possibly diesel to motorists or to trucks. But we now we moved from that position to saying, look, you have a piece of land here. Because global margins, even where the markets are not regulated, global margins on petrol tend to be relatively thin. So the realization came that, look, you have a corner piece here. What else can you do with that piece of land to generate income? So it wasn't something that was even specific to Nigeria, but it was actually a global phenomenon because it was actually demonstrated that over time, maybe 20 years, 30 years, retail margins had continuously shrunk. with the same thing that is actually happening to refining margins today. But again, that's a different story. So around 1999, taking this into consideration, I was privileged to be involved in coming up with a strategy that introduced what we call food service onto our forecourts. So we went beyond just selling, Coke and Fanta and other beverages in the mini-mart, selling milk and sugar and the like, to actually developing a partnership with UAC at the time. And that led to the introduction of the Mr. Biggs brand in several of our retail outlets across the country. That has since become an industry standard whereby many of the players in the industry have followed that model to, as you were, optimize the value of the real estate. And indeed, this is not only happening in Nigeria, but it's happening, across the globe. And as we transition to different sources of energy, abroad, you now have charging stations where you can charge electric cars. I think you are going to see a greater focus on trying to yield as much value as you can from a piece of land. For instance, there are places where you have a retail outlet today, taking Nigeria, for example, where if you were actually selling only petrol, it would just be a fruitless exercise. There would be no point in such an investment, simply because you would not be able to generate sufficient returns from selling petrol and diesel alone to pay for the cost of the real estate in those neighborhoods. So a typical, maybe an Awolowo Road, a Lekki one, the cost of the real estate in those places is so high that unless you are involved in some other activities, all you end up doing is you're just having a show to make sure that you have representation in such a highbrow location. You are not looking at the economics. So answer to your question is it's definitely something that one has to look at. It's not something limited to Nigeria, the Nigerian space alone. You've got to be able to say, this parcel of land, for 2,000 square meters, what can I do? What's the maximum value? Now, having said that, one of the interesting things I've also noticed is a lot of the newer players have developed stations that I sometimes look at and I wonder if what the economic thought behind it was, because I look at the number of pumps, the number of basically driving a very low margin volume type of thing. So I think as we continue to mature in the industry, people are going to put up stations that help to maximize the full value of the piece of land in which the station is built. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to just stay with that thought about real estate and returns on investment, because these are huge investments that marketers are making. When I was much younger, I was in high school, early university. In fact, as an undergraduate, I did my vacation job, as we used to have in those days, on Broad Street at the BP head office. I think it was 54 to 56 Broad Street in Lagos. And all around that area, the most expensive real estate in Lagos back in those days, Broad Street was the place, were airlines. I think opposite the AP or BP, later AP, and so on building, were some of the biggest airlines, that the investment house, I think it was called. Today, few airlines, if any, have any downtown offices anymore. Technology means that you do most of your business online with the airlines. Do we envisage that sometime in the near future, mega stations will be advertisement showcases for the companies, but most fuel will be dispensed from the wall of a building where there are, tanks below, and you just go there, one or two people there, and they fill your tank. Is there any vision of that emerging as the future of the industry? Let's go to Winnie Akbani for that reflection before I then turn to somebody who is on the call. He's been with us for some time, and we'll give a perspective on infrastructure and costs.
Certainly, Prof. And I'm not sure that future is going to be too far away from what we see today. We see how the world has been very, very fast evolving. And I can tell you that my company, where we have only recently gone into retail development, we make a show of it. But at the back of our mind, we know that this is not going to be a very long-lasting thing. And so we have a secondary plan for what that real estate will be used for. Because I know that there are countries in the world, there are places I've been to, and I look at the filling stations I see, particularly in neighborhoods, very posh neighborhoods. You can actually pass without, before you realize that was a station.
Yeah.
They have the pumps, they do the work. So if it's just for the purpose of selling petrol, you know that you really don't need that. But everything is a phase, and that's how we see it. And what we've looked at is, for now, what's the market? How do we get that market? But whatever you're building, are you thinking into the future? In another 10 years, who knows? You said earlier in the series that maybe the notion that one day cars will run on fuel might not be an illusion anymore. It might happen one day. Similarly, who knows? You're talking about mobile filling stations already. Some people have started that. You might not need to spend those billions putting out mega stations. So certainly you're right. Okay, it's something that any serious person who is making an investment today is looking at the plan B for that investment. And I don't think it's going to be far off. Thank you.
A major part of the challenge for players downstream today is infrastructure of distribution, storage, and all of that. And somebody who's been with us on several of these conversations is Dr. Goswili Hetu. Incidentally, they were the original PPMC before PPMC became PPMC as such. He had responsibility for pipelines and all of that. Perhaps, Dr. Hetu, we can draw you in here to reflect for us on why the pipelines failed to be what they were hoped for, a source of reducing the cost of distribution of petroleum products, of PMS and diesel and whatever other products.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, for inviting me to intervene. I think I heard Mr. Oyebanji saying he joined the industry in 1980, and at that time everything was, seemed okay. But I have a more an earlier experience than that in what was happening in that sector, even though I was not involved in it. The issues then, the issue of uniform pricing had started. The issue of, bad roads and unreliable rail transportation for products distribution had also started. So the pipeline infrastructure was actually designed envisioned in the second National Development Plan, early 70s. So by the time I became the head of pipelines in NNPC, 1978, we started with commissioning those nationwide pipeline systems. And I think by 1982, we had a fairly reliable distribution system. Mind you, it was very challenging in the sense that before then, nobody had done multi-product pipeline transfer systems. That means you are pumping PMS, you are pumping diesel, you are pumping AGO through the pipeline. So it was a novel, something novel. And I think we managed that fairly well with the support of William Brothers, who seconded many of their people to us to train our people and all that. But I think one of the speakers mentioned the fact that because of lack of funding, I think those facilities deteriorated. The maintenance level that we started with just went to the dogs because funding was not there. I think that was basically the reason. It had nothing to do with quality of personnel, because by the early 80s, we had a good crop of trained people, manning those pipelines. So I think that problem still persists. The issue of funding the pipelines. Of course, more than 80% of them, I believe, I hear, are no longer in use, which is a great tragedy, because a lot of money was put into those systems. Now you cannot pump products from Port Harcourt to Enugu. Enugu depot has been idle for many years, and that's the same story in the inland depots. So that's a major problem, and I'm not so sure what the government is doing about resuscitating that infrastructure. I'm sure they have their plans, but I'm not familiar with them. Let me add
to the question Emmanuel speaking. What if, because we are trying to use the benefit of hindsight, from the get-go, the pipelines were designed to be a joint venture with the oil retailing companies, and they had major management responsibility and had a stake in the ownership. Would things have been different? And secondly, now we're reviving the railways. Do you think that the railways will now make a significant difference in distribution as against these trucks that are damaging the roads and vested interests creating problems here and there and all of that? How do we think things will evolve in terms of moving the product?
Well, let me say that when those pipelines were being built, the consultant supervising that project recommended that we form a pipeline company. And they were recommending that on the back of what they had done in Kenya, where they had a pipeline company. And to bring matters in proper perspective, Kenya's pipeline was like less than 500 kilometers long. Ours was like 3,000 with multi-products. The Kenya one was just crude oil, Mombasa to Nairobi. Import crude oil from Mombasa, pipe to Nairobi, refined in Nairobi. But when I was appointed, it was a department of NNPC. So you can imagine the kind of support you would get at the departmental level, which was not much. If we had a pipeline company, maybe involving any of the majors, as we have mentioned, as a company, different joint venture, the story would have been different. I'm sure the story would have been different. So that is the way I want to answer that question. So the fact that we still retain government 100% participation or monopoly of the pipeline and depots is a problem. It is a problem, and I don't know how it's going to be resolved. Let me just jump in one or two things. But right. you mentioned that the upstream, that the IOCs are departing. Well, not so fast. What Shell has said is that they are going to remain on the offshore, but they're going to divest on the onshore and shallow water. So we'll still have Shell here for many years to come. In fact, they are investing in major projects like the Bonga project offshore. So we'll still have them here. The other thing I wanted to say, I've learned a lot from listening to these great downstream players, and I can hear their pain. Policy somersaults, policy lack of support, bullying regulator, policeman regulator. I think in dealing with this, we should also talk about the problem of smuggling, because what this subsidy thing does is that our petrol price here is cheaper than those in our neighboring countries. So there's a one-way traffic going out there, and there's no question customs can't do anything because of the kind of profits that these guys are making by selling across the border. That's a major thing. And I like the answers or the question that you asked about how do you ensure that this deregulation is done without too much pain. And I also heard the response there. But unfortunately, I think we have missed that point. I just want to introduce the issue of LPG. I would like our players to maybe talk about a little bit about the LPG use. And I would like to know their views on what the government is trying to do with autogas and CNG for cars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very important perspective to introduce. I was going to begin, and I'd like Gabriel Ogbeche to begin helping us here. First, many of you, the players, have invested massively in tank farms, particularly, and other infrastructure. Some of you now even have vessels ferrying products across oceans and all of that. Is there a chance that strategy could evolve down the path of, if you will, co-location, to use the word from the telecoms industry, where perhaps the way that you see competition is so tight that you don't see co-opetition, where you compete and cooperate. And so everybody builds their own tank farm, everybody does this, and somehow we, in competing, get less efficient or effective for that matter. And then if you can add on to it the question that Dr. Ihetu raised. I mean, several years ago, I was in Bangladesh and traveled around the country quite a bit. And literally, as far back as 6-7 years ago, most of the vehicles in Bangladesh run on CNG. how easy would it be for us to make transitions of that nature, and what would it require? What kind of incentives will the players require to facilitate traveling down that path?
Thank you very much, Prof. In business, just as in life, the only thing that is constant is change. And as business people, we've learned that if you don't adapt to change, then you just wake up one day and realize that you don't have a business anymore. I've been in this industry now, going 29, 30 years now. I've been in this industry since 1992. The truth is, if you go back prior to 2015, one of the most prized or most cherished product for every player in downstream was kerosene, which we call DPK. It was a high margin product. Women use it to cook, they use it for their lantern. But again, it was because up till 2015, thereabout, the product was largely subsidized. When the subsidy was removed and the price of kerosene went up, it became obvious even to the local woman that it was cheaper for her to use LPG to cook. So the business and the demand for cooking fuel moved from kerosene and to some extent firewood to LPG, which in any case is cheaper if you take away the initial cost, the investment you have to make in cylinder or gas cooker, which is where the people at the low end of the market struggle, that initial investment. But by and large, it is cheaper. So in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of investment move towards LPG. In the last 5 years, Rain Oil, for example, last year we commissioned our 8,000 metric ton liquefied petroleum gas facility in Lagos, and a couple of other people have also either built or expanded their LPG facility, like NIPCO, like 11 PLC and co. So we've seen the demand go up. Nationwide, last year for the first time, the demand crossed 1 million tons, 1 million metric ton per annum, the demand for liquefied petroleum gas, up from typically an average of 300,000 metric ton per annum. And these numbers keep going up. Because again, that is the way to go. Talking about co-location, you know, in the early days when people were building tank farm, you used to hear, oh, my tank farm is 120 million liter capacity. My tank farm is 180 million liter capacity. And I always argued that, you know, there was this mentality of my tank farm is bigger than yours. And I say, no. It's not about the size of the tank farm. Rather, it's about the throughput or the efficiency. How much product do you move through the tank farm? I can have a tank farm that is 50 million liter capacity, but you're turning over that volume 5 times a month and doing 200 million liters. Because the product is not for storage. The product is for you to put in product and then quickly dispense of it. You don't want to have 150 million liters of petrol stored in your tank per time and it's not moving. So which takes me to the issue you talked about, the co-location. The time has come for people to begin to collaborate and realize that it's all about throughput. I mean, if I have an 8,000 metric ton LPG capacity, which I can actually truck out 2,000 metric ton in a day or more, that it makes more sense for me to share that space with other marketers so that we do more of collaboration rather than needless competition. And I believe that the market and the economics of it is going to force marketers to actually begin to have that conversation. I think that conversation is long overdue. We need to begin to seriously collaborate. I even see some consolidation taking place in the industry. When Mr. Ebanji was talking, I mean, he said, and I agree with him, in the last 15 years or so, we've seen a lot of these foreign companies being taken over by the local players. We're also going to see a lot of consolidation also taking place amongst the local players, either to force this co-location or this collaboration, or the economics. I mean, with the margins being very thin, everybody cannot continue to carry the same overhead, replicating the same thing when you can push that same volume using fewer hands and fewer facilities. Now, talking about CNG, that's a conversation even the government is beginning to force marketers to have. CNG is cheaper. With the subsidy in the price of petrol, it has dawned on government that the subsidy cannot continue. But if they remove subsidy today, petrol is going to be very, very expensive. So government wants to get marketers to invest in CNG, which is cheaper and cleaner. I know that the last, a couple of months ago, we had a meeting with the Minister of State for Petroleum Petroleum Resources rather, and the group managing director of NNPC, also with the CBN, where they are putting some funds aside so that marketers can access these funds and be able to roll out CNG stations across the country. That conversation is still ongoing. The only little challenge that they need to overcome, again, is that cost of conversion. To convert a car that has been built to run on petrol to be able to run on CNG, there's this initial cost that has to be made, and how many people are ready to make that investment. And then again, what's the incentive to make that investment when petrol remains very cheap and very much available? And then again, you also have to deal with the issue of CNG station availability. I mean, like a typical example, if you want to drive from here to Onitsha, I know that if I fill my tank in Lagos, I know that if I get to Benin, I will definitely get petrol to buy. I know that if I get to Asaba, I will definitely get petrol to buy. But just imagine that my car is running on CNG and the CNG can only carry me for 300 kilometers. If there's a CNG station in Lagos and I fill my tank, what assurance do I have that if I get to Benin, there's a station that will sell CNG to me? If I get to Asaba, there's also a station that will sell CNG to me. So this is a direction that we are going, but the investment needs to be made, and that investment hasn't taken off yet. But I know that in the very near future, we are going to see a lot of traction on the CNG space.
Thank you so very much. By the way, I'd like those who would like to ask questions to begin to get ready to raise their hands so that we can call them on. But let me return to Yomi in looking at the future. Yomi, how do you see this industry, this space, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? What do you think will change? And what will be the challenges then?
So, Prof, I'm an incurable optimist, so I'm going to be very direct. 10 years from now, I expect most of the people on this call who are in this industry to have retired from it, hopefully. I'm going to rest. They've done a lot. They're global
I will have
achievers.
retired. In fact, I'm retired.
These guys are global. These men and women are global achievers. They build first-class businesses. They hire thousands of people. Some of them will be supervising, advising, political leadership, hopefully, and at that time, hopefully, using their experiences, some of which we've discussed on the call, to shape the future. I expect the industry to have consolidated significantly, and it should consolidate along the lines of global best practice, not necessarily ethnicity or man, no man, or discretionary award of government contracts or projects. So along the lines of value to the society, to the community, to the environment, hopefully. Oh my God, Prof, I expect us to use technology like we are seeing it being used in the financial services sector, an energy industry that knows who its customers are, knows what their needs are, not just for their vehicles or mobility, but certainly for their domestic use, etc. And also, collect data, use that data intelligently, interact, energy companies that interact with customers to provide as much of the energy needs as possible, leveraging technology. I'll tell you, Prof, interestingly, I traveled to a country recently where I had access to an electric car, and I couldn't help noticing that the unit in the house to power the car was branded and powered by a major oil and gas company that was primarily a leader in downstream, but very rapidly moving up the energy transition ladder. And that's what I hope to see in this country. One where leaders, don't necessarily, expect government to do anything, but they make government do things, by educating, by partnering with them, by, engaging them thoroughly, engaging people and teaching the public too. We do very little public enlightenment, you understand? All the people we complain about, whether it's the government, the regulators, or the unions, are all people who are in the industry, not necessarily better educated than us, but we expect them to make decisions that favor us, but they don't have the information necessarily and understand things. And even when they do, there are other incentives which we must come to terms with and use imagination to help them resolve. So, Prof, I see an evergreen industry. It will continue to hire people. It may not necessarily sell the same things. It may not necessarily sell petrol and diesel and kerosene or gas. It may sell data. It may sell convenience. It may sell collaboration. It may sell innovation, but the industry will exist. And that's what I see, certainly for 10 years. And I hope that that's what happens. Thank you, Prof.
Well, thank you so much. Let me again return to Ms. Mena and to raise an issue that comes up again and again and again, the environment. We have had previous conversations in which we welcomed Professor Jauro, who heads Nestria. And there's a great deal of concern about externalities that flow from the operations in the sector and the issues around the environment that are being thrown up. How do you engage to both co-educate mutually those responsible for managing the issues of the environment? Because like Yomi said, one of the biggest challenges I find is that we're not dialoguing enough. And that's, the thing about elite cohesion is so missing in Nigeria. I tell people, I had the privilege in 1998 to spend a little time in a Japanese government agency called MITI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And part of the point I keep making after that experience is that you couldn't tell where the private sector stopped and the public sector started, because there was elite consensus and elite cohesion, and the focus was Japan Incorporated, what's good for Japan. How do you up the ante on dialogue, especially around the issues of the environment, such that the best interests of the common good of all is advanced?
So let me start by saying within the industry, we've got different associations. So Mr. Oyebanji, for example, heads the Major Marketers Organization of Nigeria. Demakpani heads DAPMA, which is Depot and Petroleum Marketers Association of Nigeria. And what we've seen recently, very, very recently, is that all of these organizations, including Independent Marketers Association, Retailers Owners Association, have had to come together because everyone has realized we have a common threat, which is basically a threat to the industry as a whole. It doesn't matter whether you're in the retailing or you're in the storage side of the business and downstream. The reality is, if we do not start to engage our regulators, the legislators, the executive, we will become extinct for various reasons which have been mentioned here. And what we've now done as much as possible is to start that advocacy, start meeting with amongst ourselves, first of all, and then also meeting with whether it's DPR or the legislators, like I said, to try to see what do we do. And I've always said to everyone, the biggest threat we have to our business is the impression, the perception that people have in the industry. As a nation, people do not trust oil marketers. Once you hear oil marketers, people are like, oh, those people with the subsidy fraud, oh, those people who are exploiting Nigerians. And I've said to everyone, it's very important that as an industry, we're first and foremost able to reinvent the wheel, if you may. You know, we have to rebrand ourselves and get people to trust us. We need to put our story out there and let people know we don't make the kinds of margins that people think we make. I give you an example. During the time of the subsidy fraud, a lot of people did not understand that subsidy is not your profit. You know, it took a long time for us to educate people to say that, no, subsidy is monies which I have expended already with the promise from government that they will give me back this differential, and I've incurred that cost. So it's actually a cost, it's not my profit. But it took a long time for us to get people to understand the meaning of subsidy to start with. Now we find ourselves again in another precarious position where we're having to educate people on the gains of deregulation. I personally feel that subsidy is just money being evaporated in the instance of the fuel subsidy which government is carrying today. And to answer the question, I think it was Mr. Ahetu who mentioned the issue of subsidy and wanted us to touch on that. What I feel is that deregulation is not even something that the government can sleep on. You've heard the numbers that have been mentioned here, numbers by which government is subsidizing fuel every day. If you just take the budget and look at what was in the Nigerian budget for roads, as an example, for a lot of the infrastructure that we have, and you compare that to what government is spending on subsidizing fuel, once you put that fuel in your car, you drive, the product evaporates, that money is gone. It's not something that you can touch and feel. And that's the easiest way that I try to explain to people why we need to do away with fuel subsidy. Also, this perception that, oh, petrol, if you increase the price of petrol, everything will go up. I've also said to people, whether it's advocacy, whether it's, you know, radio jingles, whatever it is, we need to engage people and help them understand that majority of the goods and services in this country are moved by diesel. Diesel is deregulated. You heard Mr. Ogbeche speak about kerosene. Before kerosene was deregulated, everybody said, oh, the common man will die. The people at the lower end use kerosene. Today, kerosene is deregulated.
But doesn't it kind of suggest to you that there are elite players who extract rent and who encourage this view of the common man dying? Again, last week on one of the television networks, I told a personal story with telecoms. 1996, yeah. I went off to spend 1 year at the Harvard Business School to write a book on competition. And then I arrived there because I quickly get my telephone. The cost of my calling Lagos was so much cheaper that I begged my family not to call me, and I called like twice a day. And I kept, and the poor person being protected in Nigeria, you know, it was cheaper for me in rich America to call the poor person in Lagos. And I made so many calls because I felt, oh, this is cheap. Of course, I got huge bills. First month, the second month. And one day my phone rings. And I pick up the phone. And they say, look, we noticed you make a lot of phone calls. And I said, yes, to Nigeria. Is there a problem? Because I thought you were going to say, are you 419? And they said, no, not a problem. We think because you make so many phone calls, we want to reduce your rate by 50%. Exactly. And I thought, is this Father Christmas? And they said, okay, the first 2 months, those bills you've already paid. we make that your welcome, whatever, and you would deduct that. You know, you won't pay until you've exhausted that 2 months or $1,000 something. Welcome. So how do we somehow manage, after all these examples, to keep up with this story of protecting the common man?
So again, that's why I'm talking about this issue of advocacy. And what I was going to say was, when we have this kind of forum to talk about these issues, we need to be able to speak about these things and get thought leaders like yourself and anybody else who listens and now has facts to go to public with. So in other words, that advocacy to educate people, to let them know that in reality, this is just some hogwash which is being told out there. Yes, people use petrol, but how much petrol is truly consumed in Nigeria? I'm not sure that there's anybody who can tell you in all honesty today, this is the daily consumption in country. Mr. Ahetu spoke about the smuggling and the arbitrage being so much that you're able to buy, I mean, if you like, line up all the security officials all the way to the borders. There's enough to go around. Yeah. So unless we as a people then say, what is the opportunity cost? What are we losing here by continuing to subsidize this product? How do we get out of this? And guess what? What will eventually happen is exactly what you just spoke about. I tell people that the downstream oil sector of the industry is the most competitive industry. You heard what Mr. Ogbeche said, we got to a point where people were saying, my tank farm is bigger than yours. That's exactly what's going to happen with pricing. Once the market is deregulated, every single marketer would want to be the person with the lowest price in the market. But over and beyond just pricing, what you will then have is a real service industry. Because if I know that the market is deregulated, I'm not only thinking about lowering the cost of product in my retail station. At this point, I'm thinking, what other services can I render that would have the pull effect and make people come to my retail station rather than go to the next retail station? It changes the entire landscape. But more than that, you will also find that you have a lot more people who are willing to invest, people who are willing to collaborate. I don't think that you go to any country in the world and you see as many petrol stations as you see in Nigeria. What you would find is there are probably 6, 7 major names, brands that you find, and everyone else is a dealer. So for every retail outlet you go to, they probably have a franchise or something, which they've taken from the person who has the brand. But you will start to see those kinds of things and standards will become better. In terms of collaboration, I think it's something that we like it or not, we will get to. Just as Mr. Ogbeche said, we're going to get to a point where people have to come together to say, does it make sense for me to have all of these assets and not be able to utilize them? Why don't I partner with somebody else who is able to use part of it and we share the cost? Now, coming back to the main question which you asked, which was basically the environmental impacts of all of the things that we do. The entire world today is talking about moving away from fossil fuels. I personally don't think that's going to happen as fast as everyone thinks it will happen. Yes, you're not going to have as many vehicles running on fuel, but you still need fossil fuels because for every engine that is running, you need lubricants, whether it's grease, whether it's the engine oil. So it's not going to disappear the way people think it will. However, what you're going to find is that people will become more responsive when it comes to carbon emissions. What can I do to reduce my carbon print, right? So today you probably have some retail owners talking about how do they reduce the cost of generating electricity in their stations, because I doubt that there are more than 40% retail outlets in Nigeria that run on power from power holding, whether it's any of the distributors that you have depending on which state. Most stations that you find run on generators, which means that they're burning diesel and they're emitting some kind of carbon. But you're going to find people now saying, how do I transit from this diesel consumption to cleaner fuel? So can I use renewables? Can I power my station using solar energy? What can I do? Those are the kinds of things that you will find. And those are the kinds of conversations and discussions that people will start to have amongst themselves in terms of carbon reduction. And hopefully we get to the point where we even go beyond just trying to reduce our carbon footprint to actually tapping into what you have all over the world, the COP26 and all of that, where we now have credits for carbon reduction. I hope we will get there, and I think we will get there soon through this collaboration. That's one way by which you will see that we will start to reduce those footprints in the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are some questions, but Mr. Chikenwanze has his hand raised. If we could invite Mr. Wanze to make a comment or pose a question, and then I'll get to, just for us to reflect on this, Mr. Victor Ezeja has asked the question, what could be the best strategy to adopt after ending subsidy? Now, I'm not sure for who, of course, different consumers have their strategy, marketers will have their strategy, the national economy will have its strategy, but anyone who can speak to the broad spectrum of strategy in post-deregulation for a PMS market. So we'll take Mr. Wanze now.
Thank you very much, Pat. I will continue to thank you for this program, and really appreciate very much the presentation of Mr. Oyebanji and my dear sister Winifred, and even the presentation also of my good friend Dr. Ihetu. This series is history series, so I would like for us to go back to history. The reason, several times, Pat, I've told, I've asked any representative from government or the institution. But the only consolation I have is that you are recording a lot of these things. You've done a lot, and the good Lord will continue to bless you. I just want to address the issue of the infrastructure. You gave an example of when fuel was being delivered by train, when your dad was with BP. You see, that was the way our economy was structured. If you look at the 3 breweries built by Nigerian brewery in those days, Aba, Lagos, and Kaduna, they got their products imported into the Apapa Wharf. It was moved by train. It stopped at the Nigerian brewery in Ijora, Igomu. Then he lives there. He goes to Kaduna, all of them by railway sidings. You see, because the unit cost of transportation leans very heavily on products. So what did we do in the first instance when we were setting up the steel mills? We had a steel mill. The production was at Alaja. And you have a steel mill in Osogbo where there's railway siding. There was no railway between Warri and Osogbo. So they were moving those things by trailers. Then they moved, you went to Katsina. There was no railway siding even there. In Jos, yes, there was a railway siding, but no link with Warri. So what were they doing? They were moving it by trailers. How many billets did the trailers carry? So we do not have emphasis.
Bad planning.
I know our planning really is based on rent seeking, pure and simple. You have said it. Now you take the question of pipeline that Dr. Ihetu mentioned here, where they had wanted the pipeline to be a separate company. Recently, there was the hackers, the hackers from Russia on the pipeline in the US. It was a private pipeline. It was a private company because government cannot run business. So must continue to hammer on these issues. We must. Let's not give up. So it's you especially, you are doing your best. People are not listening. our policies in most cases are based on rent seeking. And what we want to do, the regulators, all they are looking at is power and control for rent seeking. That's all. So I thank you very much, for this.
Thank you. Part of what worries me is that there was even a time in our country when public servants gave so much in planning and all of that. I mean, I've just written something in the last 24 hours. I wrote a tribute to architect Fola Alade, who passed away.
Yeah, I read it.
And the enormous work he did as a civil servant. And, just reflecting further, because I wrote a PhD thesis, sitting with people like Ime Ebong, who, as PAMSEC, ran a planning department that literally built Nigeria. And people like Chivoyegu, Ezife, and all of those, John Edozian, these were all people who worked in that planning department. Yeah. Architect Alade and Yegu literally created Festac, and none of them owns a plot of land in Festac or house. So the big question is what went wrong? I'm still trying to figure it out, because these men, even from the public sector, did these things with such passion, such commitment, achieved significantly, and it worked for the country. But it seems not to happen anymore. At some point in time, which I'm still working on trying to understand, culture collapsed. And that is the trouble we have till today. But that's for... So let me take a minute from each of the panelists who may want to react to the strategy question post deregulation strategy from any perspective that you would like to. Let me begin with Mr. Ibanji.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Well, my hope and prayer is that with PIB, like Dame Akpani said, there are some aspects of it that we have some reservations about, but essentially one of the key things, positives, is that hopefully it will take us to a deregulated environment, especially for the price of gasoline, which is the major product we currently consume. Now, one of the things people need to understand is that when that happens, you see, we will move from an environment where margins have been fixed by government. So automatically that you will make 6 naira or whatever per liter, whether it's adequate or it's not adequate, at least you know what that number is. In this very competitive post-deregulation era, that guarantee of fixed margin may no longer be the case. And like I told you, all over the world, when you look at the trend, margins on gasoline have continued to go down over the years. So what that means is that we are going to have a very, very competitive environment. And that is what is going to drive those strategies of consolidation or partnership. We will find automatically that each of us replicating the same assets at very huge size just doesn't make sense. You will find that people will now be forced, because margins may actually get thinner, to start looking at how do we invest to improve our efficiency so that the cost of delivery of products are going to be done at a much cheaper rate than what they are we are currently doing. So all those things are going to be things that will emerge from this kind of environment. All you need to do is to look at the telecoms industry, to look at the banking industry, to see people running promos, to see what people will do to attract more people to their own forecourts or to their sites. You look at technology, for instance. In America, if you drive into an Exxon station, you can pay for your fuel with your phone app. You just, you've even moved from putting your card in the pump to pay to being able to pay with your phone. Your phone app will talk to the pump and you will be able to make payment. So it's that kind of environment that this regulation situation will bring about, which ultimately is going to benefit the consumer. It will benefit the industry because we will be forced to operate at a much more efficient level. So I am looking forward very much to that time. Yes, it means that it will become the survival of the fittest. So whoever is not willing to innovate will fall by the wayside. The current subsidized regulated price is just rewarding inefficiency. That is why you find a truck that is 50 years old, emitting diesel all over, smoke all over the place, and driving at 5 kilometers per hour with no brakes, is going on the road because he knows he's going.
Okay, I think you've become muted. We can't hear you anymore. Okay, but let me invite them, Winnie Akpani, to give her reflection.
Taking on from what Mr. Ebanji has said, for me, two key words is that we're going to have healthy competition and efficiency. And at the end of the day, the consumer is better for it. One thing we talk about subsidy, Amina has explained it very clearly. Subsidy was never a profit. It's not and will never be a profit to the marketer. So it's of no use to us as marketers. The most important thing, what people need to realize is that we're subsidizing the rich. We're not subsidizing the poor. It's only the rich man who has 5 or 10 cars in his house. Each child has a car to go to school. Mother has a car, father has a car, drivers have cars. At the end of the day, one house is fueling 10 cars because petrol is so cheap, they don't even have to think about it. I mean, I also said that diesel is not subsidized, and that is what really affects the poor man the most. Today's diesel is almost 300 naira per liter. A few months ago, it was 200 naira per liter. It moves with the crude oil. If we are saying that subsidy is for the poor, why are we not subsidizing diesel? Why are we subsidizing petrol? I actually look forward very much to a post-subsidy era because then we're going to have fair play. And then when you look at the real consumption of petrol in Nigeria, about 30% of it is Lagos. How many people in Lagos need that subsidy? Again, you're subsidizing the rich. So government just has to get out of this illusion.
Indeed, wouldn't it be a better subsidy to help retrofit all the buses to run on CNG with government help, and then, get more of those buses running to make it easier for those quote unquote poor to get to where they're going? Because it's, if you're going to have any kind of subsidy, it needs to be more thoughtful like that.
You're correct. In fairness, the meeting that Gabriel referred to, okay, that was one of the major issues there, that there was a need to do all that to those buses. But you have to also, you have to back up your talk with immediate action. So we need to see government come to that immediately. It is very, very important. But I'm still insisting that saying that that's the only condition you're going to remove subsidy, I think is also a bit far-fetched, because right now we can't afford the subsidy we're enjoying. Nigeria cannot afford it. But fine, we give it to them. But can we just hurry up on that and get to it such that you can save this? If you're saving 8 billion naira a day from subsidy, I think it's a lot of money. Imagine how much education we can buy with that. Imagine how many health centers we can build with that. So many things to be done. Okay, but for me, most importantly, like Yomi also mentioned, technology. We're going to get to that level. You're either competitive or you're out. And that can only happen in a post-deregulation era. You either get competitive or your business cannot survive. You are going to use technology. We're going to use so many things already, even with the deregulation. It's already so competitive. We're all forever thinking of how to make that extra 50 kobo. Even though Mr. Evanji says, oh, the margins, you know what you're going to make. Even now, it's not so easy earning that money. Everybody running a retail station knows that. Why do I have to buy from you if I can go to the next station and enjoy another 50 kobo difference? Okay, so for me, I think that's the way to go. And then we're also going to have more reasonable investments coming. We don't want to continue to run trucks. How many trucks are we running a day? The pipelines need to work. NNPC have how many storage facilities in Nigeria? Yet, they are renting storages from us depot owners. Why is that so? Don't stay in business where you cannot run business. Government is not a business company. You are not in government to run businesses. Leave businesses for those who are wired to run businesses. And please just go into the business of regulating whatever you're supposed to regulate and running the economy. I think at the end of the day, that will help us better as a nation. Thank you. Did I lose my connection?
We are here. You are there, madam.
Okay, thank you. It was so quiet. Maybe Prof lost his.
I think it's a fast connection.
Yes, probably. Okay, he's coming on now.
Thank you so much. Let me invite Yomi to give his own closing thoughts.
Prof, thank you for the session. Just listening to some of these comments from some of the most influential people in the downstream industry, again, reminds me that, I've always felt that there's hope for the sector. I don't think the sector, the way it is, the things it sells and the way it sells them, and the way it goes about its business is sustainable. I also do not agree entirely that government is the issue. Indeed, I don't know who government is. I think persons here themselves, if they chose, could be jolly well be in government at the highest level. They have the expertise and the credentials and the capacity. I hope that, going forward, we do some of the things that Amina spoke about, use our collective will, our collective experience, our collective capacities to shape the outcomes of the industry in the short term and in the medium term. If we're going to talk about deregulation, indeed, there's a world-class $7 billion refinery coming up in Lekki, not far from here. We're literally 4 or 5 kilometers from here. I think one of the questions we should be asking ourselves specifically is, what are we doing and how are we thinking about tapping into that resource in terms of scale, jobs creation, industry policy? And I think our time is up. We haven't done that. I don't think there could have been a more important question today, instead of looking back, but looking forward. And what tends to happen in the downstream is that things then unravel, and then we end up being victims to causes we could jolly well have shaped. And I hope that on a going forward basis, that's not what we do. Prof, I have to say this. Some of the people on the call and some not here, from Amina to Mr. Beche, to Mr. Oyebanji, to Dame, and some of the other people on the call are the finest entrepreneurs in this country. They have done what they do despite the issues with resilience and consistency, though locally, but they've done it to global acclaim. The question is, collectively, what do we agree on? And what can we do with what we agree on? And hopefully, I already told you how I see the downstream in a few years. Hopefully, it's an innovation-driven energy provider, not fuels provider, that taps into data to help consumers to operate in a more convenient platform, not petrol stations, indeed not even gas or diesel. Those things I think are mundane. I hope it's about energy, it's about clean energy transition, and convenience to customers. But again, Prof, thank you. I'm not eligible to speak next to these guys, so it's a pleasure and an honor for me. Thank you very much, Prof. God bless.
Thank you, Yomi. I will, by the way, let me apologize for Engineer Mansour Ahmed, who has been with us on this several times in manufacturing, in the oil and gas sector. He flew into Kano for something. He was hoping to join us. I don't think he has managed to make it. I wanted him to speak to the impact of the Dangote refinery, but we've got to go. Unfortunately, time is up. And I'll take the last closing thought from Gabriel Ubichi.
Thank you, Prof. Post deregulation, I have my concerns. That's the truth. Regardless of what anybody say, the industry needs to be deregulated. But again, the regulated regime so far has guaranteed marketers fixed margins. So regardless of how efficient or not so efficient every marketer is, there are margins for the retailer, margins for the storage, margins for the transporter, all kinds of margins embedded in a structure created by government. Now, once you deregulate, though a lot of those margins will fly out of the window, not because those margins shouldn't be there, but typically competition is going to be very brutal, and we will see what we've always seen, a race to the bottom. We've seen it on diesel. Diesel is deregulated. Diesel today, you're more likely to lose money than to make money. Jet fuels, otherwise called DPK or ATK or whatever name you choose to call it, is deregulated. The margins are very thin. We see the same thing happening on petrol. If the regulation comes, margins are going to get very, very tight. So the only way to go will now be how efficient you are, how much you're able to save money, how much you are now able to collaborate. That is when marketers will be forced to have those conversations that we have so far refused to have. What am I doing with a 100 million liter capacity tank farm and my neighbor has a 100 million liter capacity tank farm, and between two of us, we are not doing more than 20 million liters a month? Why am I running a massive generator in my tank farm, employing a depot manager? You are employing a depot manager. When, if we combine our two capacities into one, our capacity utilization will still be under 50%. In other words, there's still going to be a lot of idle capacity. So those conversations, I see the regulation forcing us to have those conversations. But there are conversations that we still have to have regardless of which way this industry goes. So we look forward to very interesting times, but it is something that definitely will have to happen. At this point, I would thank you, Prof, for putting this together. It's been very, very interesting. I've been very interested listening to Ibanji, listening to Winnie Akpani, Amina, and of course, my good friend Yomi Awoboku, who is always sounding very humble, but a man with tremendous capacity. Yomi, I appreciate you always. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and my appreciation to all of you. This is a journey that we all must brace ourselves to embark on for the good of the economy, for the good of our individual businesses in the long run, if we do the needful. I do believe that, in the US, for example, there are people who drive across town 20 miles to go and fill their tank because they know that somebody offers a much better price in the other part of town. And by the time people see those kinds of developments, we will find creative ways of ensuring that we can compete well and thrive, even in the midst of the challenges of a deregulated environment. But thank you all so very much. Again, apologies from Uche Oga, who's in the village with the APC congresses, and Engineer Ahmed, who is caught in Kano this afternoon on some event. But this has been a really remarkable conversation, and I thank you all so much for contributing. And I look forward to our continuing at least one more session or two on the oil and gas sector before we move to the finance sector. This, the 26th in the series. Thank you also very much, and God bless. Have a wonderful week, each one.